Something changed in the Pantanal. The capybaras felt it before the cameras did. They stopped grazing at the water's edge. They moved in tighter groups. They didn't go out alone anymore. For decades, the largest tropical wetland on Earth had been missing its top predator. The jaguar was gone, and the entire ecosystem had quietly rearranged itself around that absence. Then Brazil made a decision, and everything, slowly, irreversibly, began to shift again. The Pantanal is the largest tropical wetland on the planet. Nearly 150,000 square kilometers of flooded plains, river channels, and dense forest sprawling across western Brazil into Bolivia and Paraguay. It should be one of the most alive places on Earth. But by the early 2000s, something fundamental had gone wrong. Ranchers had pushed deep into the region for over a century. Cattle operations replaced native vegetation along the corridors where large predators once moved. Poaching, quiet, persistent, and largely unpunished, had done the rest. The jaguar population had collapsed. Surveys conducted by Brazilian conservation researchers estimated fewer than 300 individual jaguars remained across the entire Brazilian Pantanal basin. 300 animals in a wetland the size of Germany. The effects were not immediately visible, but they were real. Without the jaguar, caiman populations grew unchecked. Capybara herds expanded far beyond their historical numbers, moving into areas they had never consistently occupied. Riverbank vegetation began to erode under the pressure of overgrazing. The system was drifting, quietly, slowly, but unmistakably. Local rangers working the northern Pantanal described stretches of riverbank that had been stripped bare, areas that decades earlier had been dense with ground-level vegetation. The land looked tired. One senior field researcher who had worked the region since the 1980s said the Pantanal felt like a clock still ticking, but missing its main spring. Something essential had been removed. And in 2001, a small team of Brazilian conservationists began asking a question that almost nobody in government wanted to take seriously. Could it be put back? The organization was called Instituto Onça Pintada, a Brazilian conservation group founded by a wildlife biologist who had spent years tracking jaguar movement patterns across the Pantanal, on foot and by river. They had data. They had mapped the remaining jaguar corridors. They knew exactly where the animals had disappeared from and roughly why. What they needed was political will. It took years of pressure, field documentation, and formal proposals before the Brazilian government agreed to support a structured reintroduction program. In 2018, in partnership with the Cheetah Conservation Fund and several Brazilian federal agencies, the program received official backing. The plan was precise. Jaguars rescued from conflict zones, animals that had attacked livestock and been captured before ranchers could kill them, would be rehabilitated and released into protected areas of the northern Pantanal. The first release happened in a remote sector near the Tres Hermanos river confluence. A male jaguar, approximately 4 years old, fitted with a GPS collar that would transmit location data every 4 hours. The team released him at dusk. He disappeared into the tree line in under 40 seconds. For the first 2 weeks, the researchers monitored his movements from a base camp. He was cautious. He stayed close to dense cover. He moved mostly at night. Then, on the 16th day, his GPS signal placed him 11 kilometers from the release point. He had found the capybara herds along the southern floodplain. What happened next was not what the researchers expected. It wasn't the hunting that surprised them. It was how the capybaras responded. The capybaras had never seen a jaguar. Not a single animal in those herds had ever encountered one. 2 full generations had been born and grazed along those riverbanks without a top predator anywhere near them.
They had forgotten how to be afraid. But fear, it turns out, is not entirely forgotten. It is inherited. Within days of the jaguar's arrival in the floodplain sector, the capybara herds began shifting their behavior in ways the field researchers found difficult to explain at first. The herds pulled back from open water edges during daylight hours. They stopped grazing in isolated groups. The larger males began positioning themselves at the perimeter of the herds, rather than feeding at the center. Nobody had taught them this. No conditioning had occurred. The jaguar had not even made a confirmed kill in that sector yet. The animals were responding to something they could smell and sense, but had not yet seen. And that behavioral shift, that pullback from the riverbanks, had an immediate and measurable consequence. The exposed riverbank vegetation, stripped thin from years of constant grazing pressure, began to recover. Within one season, researchers documenting ground cover on a 12-kilometer stretch of the southern floodplain recorded a 34% increase in low vegetation density compared to the previous year's baseline survey. One jaguar, one corridor, one season.
But here was the detail that stopped the research team cold. The jaguar had only made 3 confirmed kills in that entire stretch during those months. 3. The capybaras weren't responding to death. They were responding to the possibility of it. And that possibility was quietly rebuilding an ecosystem. By 2023, the program had released 17 jaguars across 3 separate corridors in the northern and central Pantanal. Not all of them survived. 2 were killed in conflict with cattle ranchers operating near the buffer zones. 1 disappeared from GPS tracking entirely. His collar went silent somewhere in the dense interior, cause unknown. But the others held their territories. And the data coming back from the field was unlike anything the research team had projected in their original models. Caiman populations in the monitored sectors had stabilized after years of unchecked growth. Capybara herd density along active jaguar corridors had dropped by an estimated 22% compared to unmonitored control areas. That number alone reshaped the entire riverbank dynamic. With grazing pressure reduced, native marsh grasses and riverside shrub species began returning to stretches of bank that conservation records showed had been bare since the early 1990s. Fish populations in those same stretches increased, the vegetation providing shade, root structure, and insect habitat that had been absent for decades. The river itself began to look different. Clearer in some sectors, slower in the shallows, more structured along the edges. Aerial surveys comparing 2019 baseline imagery against 2023 photographs showed visible differences in riparian vegetation density across nearly 400 kilometers of monitored waterway. 400 kilometers, driven, at least in part, by 17 animals. But here was the detail the lead field researcher described as the most difficult to process professionally. The greatest ecological recovery was not happening where the jaguars were hunting. It was happening where the capybaras simply believed they might be. Think about what actually happened here. A wetland the size of Germany began healing itself. Not because of mass intervention, not because of billion-dollar infrastructure, not because entire species were reintroduced by the hundreds, because 17 animals walked back into a landscape that had forgotten them, and the landscape remembered. That is the part that stays with you. The capybaras didn't need to be hunted into submission. They needed to believe, on some deep biological level, that the world they lived in had rules again. Predator and prey, risk and caution, movement and stillness. The Pantanal had been running without those rules for decades, and the cost had been invisible until you looked at stripped riverbanks, destabilized fish populations, and caiman numbers that no longer made ecological sense. One reintroduction program restored the logic, and the ecosystem, quietly and without ceremony, began to correct itself. There is a broader truth buried in this story. Nature does not need perfection. It does not need every species restored simultaneously, every habitat pristine, every human pressure removed. It needs enough. Enough of the right pressure in the right place at the right time. 17 jaguars were enough. Today, the northern Pantanal corridors still hold some of the most active jaguar territories recorded in Brazil in over 30 years. The capybaras still graze along those riverbanks, but they don't go to the water's edge alone anymore. And somehow, that small, ancient caution is holding an entire ecosystem together. If this kind of story matters to you, the real ones, the quiet ones, the ones that actually happened, consider subscribing. There are more of them, and they are worth knowing.